So some of you may have attended the other sessions. This is a series hosted by Cows and Fish and in the Environmental Law Center. We're hosting them through February and March, and we hope you can join us for the whole series. You will notice that they're being held Wednesdays at 1 and Thursdays at 7, the same session topic each in the same week. So if you didn't sign up directly and somehow got forwarded a link and are joining us that way, please sign up on Eventbrite, which you can see the link, look up our winter speaker series that way. We want to acknowledge that we're hoping to reach people across the province and throughout Alberta. And in doing so, we want to acknowledge that we are providing content across Treaty 6, 7, and 8 territories, traditional territories of many different First Nations across the province. If you are participating from some other location, of course, please take a moment to acknowledge the traditional lands upon which you are on and in. We also want to acknowledge the Métis Nation and many other First Nations whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries and millennia. That long relationship definitely includes both experience and knowledge gained, a deep and strong sense of connection to the land, water, and fish and wildlife. So thank you to those from the First Nations who are joining us today as well. And again, if you are joining us from some other location, we encourage you to acknowledge the treaty lands that you are a part of as well. This is a series, hopefully you've joined us already for the riparian restoration and bank stabilization topics, which were last week. Next week will be responsible recreation and how to minimize impacts, and techniques and strategies related to regulations and restoration of riparian recreational activities. And then the following week will be beaver coexistence tools. So if you're new to Zoom, you'll notice that your video is off and only myself and the other panelists have our video on. And likewise with audio, you are muted. At the end, if we have the opportunity, we can unmute for a Q&A session if people would like to do verbal questions if we don't have too many people on the call. You'll notice that depending on how you've set up your screen, you may see one or multiple speakers at the same time. So you have the option to set up your screen in whatever way you want in Zoom. If you aren't familiar with that, usually that's in the top right of your screen. You can choose a gallery view, which would allow you to see the multiple speakers, or you can set it up so it's only showing you whoever's speaking. During the panel session, you might want to see all the panelists at the same time, for instance. We encourage you to use the chat function throughout, add comments, and we'll be posting links to some of the regulations and things you need to think about during the topics. But we would ask you to put any actual questions for our speakers in the Q&A box. Both the chat and Q&A, depending on your setup, are probably on the top or the bottom of your screen. The chat function is like a little box, and the Q&A function looks like two comment bubbles. So if you click on those, you have the ability to type in those boxes. So Cows and Fish and the Environmental Law Center are working on this together because we have a lot of shared mandate. Cows and Fish's mandate is to help foster the stewardship and care of riparian areas through education and outreach. And the Environmental Law Center likewise has a strong mandate to educate and champion for strong environmental laws that benefit clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. So a really good fit for us to work together on this series. Probably most of you know what a riparian area is. If you don't, it's that area that's next to any water body, a stream, a river, a lake, or a wetland. It's that area that's influenced by that extra water in and from that water body. And that extra water results in a higher water table and water-loving plants that like to keep the roots wet, and the soils are often saturated or even sometimes inundated by water. So that's that moist area next to all kinds of different water bodies, where we hope is performing a variety of ecological functions like those listed here. And when a riparian area is healthy, it can do all of these kinds of things. But sometimes our land uses or activities may have influenced the ability of these places to function. And so that's what we want to talk about in this series, is if we're doing restoration work, or if we're trying to maintain or improve riparian areas to keep them functioning, what are the regulations we need to think about in those management or restorative activities? So it might be that there's bare ground or erosion. It might be that there's multiple land uses to think about. We might be on public or private land. And all of those things might lead us to try to do something different, or have management in place to minimize your impacts and to return these sites to health. But we have to think about the rules and the regulations that we're operating under. And so if this picture makes you feel uncomfortable and have some angst, because laws and regulations can be scary and they can be confusing, hopefully the series will help address some of that concern and make it easier to see what's needed, but also that it is possible to work through those things successfully. So we're going to be covering a variety of topics in the series, and many of the regulatory aspects are similar, but we're trying to give you some examples that are specific and relevant for different kinds of activities you might do in riparian areas. And that includes recreational activities, including trying to avoid impacts, restoring activities, bank stabilization, things like livestock crossings, which we're going to talk about tonight, and beaver coexistence tools, which are next week, how to manage those challenges, but yet maintain a healthy riparian area. And if we have time in the future, we're hoping to do another set of sessions on offsite watering systems as well. So we want to get a sense of who's joining us today. So you should see a poll coming up on your screen. And if you could fill in that poll, that would be great. You just have to click on the most applicable description and then submit. Great, so you can see that we have a mixture of folks. Not everybody filled in the poll, but we do have some people in agriculture, some folks in the non-government and conservation agriculture sector. And so we encourage you to share with those people you work with or in your own activities what you learned tonight. You'll notice that if the poll doesn't leave from your screen, you just have to close it out with the little X on the top so that it's not in your view. So we've already covered the welcome in the background. That's from me, Noreen Ambrose with Cows and Fish. Our next speaker is going to be Jason Unger, and I'll introduce him in a second. Following him, you'll have a couple case studies to learn from by our next two speakers, and then we'll close with a question and answer session and do a summary at the end. So Jason, if you'd like to bring up your presentation, that'd be great, and I'll introduce you while you do that. So Jason is joining us for the whole series, and we're really glad to have him throughout. As I mentioned, and you saw before, he's with the Environmental Law Centre, and he's the Executive Director as well as General Counsel for the Environmental Law Centre, which is an Alberta-based charity that's focused on legal education, environmental and natural resources law reform. His practice has focused on issues of water law, legal tools for conservation on private lands, environmental assessment law, species at risk, and pollution prevention work. Prior to joining the ELC, he worked in private practice firms both in Edmonton and Calgary, and that included working before the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench, the Alberta Court of Appeal, Natural Resources Conservation Board. So quite a wealth of practical experience outside of his work beforehand. He's also a member of the Alberta Water Council, a multi-stakeholder organization that provides advice and input on provincial water policy in Alberta. So with that, Jason's going to be talking about spanning water courses and spanning regulatory jurisdictions. So take it away, Jason.
Getting the echo here there. Hopefully it'll go away. It seems okay now. So I hope everyone can hear me all right, and welcome to this evening's discussion. My name is Noreen mentioned, Jason Unger, and I'm the Executive Director at the Environmental Law Centre. So today we'll talk about livestock crossings and basically what the regulatory system in play is and how it came about, kind of getting an understanding of why the rules are as they are, why there's such a regulatory kind of, I shouldn't say mess, but if it is, it can seem like a mess when you're confronted with some of these regulatory approaches. So when we talk about livestock crossings, we're really talking about potential impacts on water bodies and the water course itself. And when we start talking about those types of impacts on riparian areas, impacts on the shore or bed of a water body, impacts in the water itself, impacts on fisheries, we can trigger a variety of jurisdictions over these systems. One of the biggest issues is if there's fish or fish habitat, because that triggers the federal jurisdiction over the Fisheries Act. There can be common law issues that arise in relation to riparian owners and the rights of riparian owners downstream. But then also, and probably most relevantly in almost all cases, is the Public Lands Act and the Water Act, which regulate a lot of the things we do in and around water bodies in the province. And finally, the Municipal Government Act can apply in certain instances, although it won't always apply. So the municipality may pass some bylaws or have development permit processes that may apply in certain instances. In the terms of intensive or livestock crossings, it's less likely, but it's always important to be aware of the development permitting process that is required in your municipality as well. So why is water such a regulatory challenge? And when we look at water, obviously it's always moving, it's evaporating, it's creating sediment, it's moving sediment, it's creating banks, it's wearing away banks through erosion. It's a really big challenge, and we also have the aquatic environment to consider. So the drivers of these challenges can really go to three core kind of cogs in driving the challenges. One is the land-water connections. So basically how we operate on the land often will have implications on the water, whether it's runoff or hydrology, different impacts to how we, what type of vegetation is in place. And then of course, if there's any type of disturbance, that will also have a land-water connection. Secondly, and it's a big one, the Canadian Constitution. Back in the day, 1867, the government of the day decided, okay, we're going to separate jurisdiction. Inland fisheries and coastal fisheries are going to be the jurisdiction of the federal government, whereas property and other kind of civil rights around property and resources will be provincial in nature. And finally, we have the common law, which is basically judge-made law over years and years and a couple of hundred years. In the case of Canada and Britain, where we get our common law from, it's evolved through time as well. And now it's often reflected in our legislation, and I'll briefly touch on how that occurs. And this is where I do a very quick, brief history in water law and property. So when people first came, when settlers came, I shouldn't say when people, the First Nations, of course, were here prior to that, but when we imported British law in terms of riparian rights, we imported their water law, and the real focus of that was on riparian rights. So if a water body traveled by your land, you had specific rights at common law related to your property to divert that water, to manage issues around drainage, and there were also obligations with that right, specifically to downstream users. So you couldn't take all the water, for instance, because that would be removing the ability of downstream users. Similarly, you couldn't impair the quality of that water for downstream users either. If you did so, basically a person would have the right to go to court to basically seek injunction and damages and that type of thing. So if you look at this figure, parcel A is the riparian owner, but parcel B has no water. And that's one of the big challenges of the riparian rights and the common law rights related to those riparian owners, is that you can't easily settle an area if B has no access to water. So that's one of the areas of common law and how it's evolved. Similarly, common law rights for navigation and fishing. Navigation is also a federal area of jurisdiction. That was also imported into Canada, and it exists to this day. So there's a public right to navigation and fishing, and that was reflected in a presumption that the Crown itself owns not only the water, but the bed and shore of that water. So this is a 1921 case, a Court of Appeal case that discusses this in the Alberta context. And this kind of bed and shore and water right was reflected in federal legislation back in 1894, the Northwest Irrigation Act, and is carried forward into the water legislation and public land legislation in Alberta today. And if we look at the history of this, back in the day, there was a bunch of land, Rupert's land, granted to the Hudson's Bay Company. This land was then deeded back to the Dominion of Canada. So the Hudson's Bay Company had ownership kind of in the 1670s era up until the 1800s, the late 1800s. And that gave way to Canada in the 1898, for instance, as this map shows. Alberta is still not a province. So the federal government still has a large role to play in terms of how we settle the province and how the water is managed and how the land's managed. That changes, of course, in 1905 when Alberta joins Canada, it becomes a province. And really a big key issue here is in 1930 when the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement occurs. And that resulted in a variety of resources and a lot of the Crown-owned land being transferred to the province. So it went from the federal Crown to the provincial Crown. And this resulted in the Water Resources Act being passed in 1931. And it confirms that the Crown owns the water. A lot of the licenses issued under that older legislation that were permanent, and there was some ability to transfer licenses, but that's been expanded now. In terms of the Public Lands Act, there was also an evolution. So prior to the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, the beds and shores were basically still under the control of the federal government. Water Resources Act integrates some of the Crown ownership, the language here, the beds, shores of lakes, rivers, streams, or bodies of water and former water-covered areas are owned by the Crown in 1949 as an example. But this doesn't include all bodies of water or the beds and shores of all bodies of water. There were some grants way back in the day, primarily related to rail lands. There's the rail companies who owned the lands. So there are instances where the beds and shores of some water bodies, but it's quite limited, are not Crown owned. In 1984 then, the Public Lands Act was amended to add the phrasing of permanent and naturally occurring. So the water bodies that are permanent and naturally occurring, the beds and shores of those water bodies are owned by the Crown. Water law today, we have the Water Act and the Public Lands Act. And again, just to reiterate, the property in and the right to diversion and use of all water in the province is vested in the Crown under the Water Act. And under the Public Lands Act, the title to the beds and shores of all permanent and naturally occurring bodies of water and all naturally occurring rivers, streams, watercourses, and lakes is vested in the Crown. So you'll note here, I've underlined some phrasing there, because you'll notice that the bodies of water has this phrasing of permanent and naturally occurring. And permanency is kind of dealt with through a certain analysis the government has developed over time. And there's been cases around that as well in the past. But you'll note that rivers, streams, watercourses, and lakes only need to be naturally occurring. The permanence isn't applicable to those areas. So even ephemeral streams or kind of seasonal streams and watercourses can be claimed as public land, the beds and shores of those. So what does this all mean? Basically, the acts then go on to set out a variety of prohibitions, so restrictions on what you can do. Of course, they also give ways of authorizing certain impacts on Crown land or in the water body. So under the Water Act, it's very broad in terms of its scope. It says no activity without an approval, basically its approach. And activity is very broadly defined, and it includes disturbances to land or to water and water bodies, with the consequence of flow changes to flow direction or quantity, siltation, erosion, those types of things, and impacts on the aquatic environment. So it's quite a broad prohibition. And as we'll discuss, certain types of water crossings are exempt because they can comply with a code of practice, but then you have to comply with that code of practice. There's also other exemptions to activities in the water ministerial regulation that outline certain instances where you don't need an authorization. Public Lands Act prohibitions, similarly, no person shall cause, permit, oops, typo there, permit or suffer loss or damage to public land, or things that are injurious to watershed capacity, or to injure the bed and shore. So these are the starting points of those prohibitions. So these are the types of things where if you're approaching a water body, it's important to recognize that these restrictions are in place, assuming you don't have an authorization in place. So how do we discern what the bed and shore are? We talk about riparian areas, which may reflect the shoreline, but it could be broader than that. But the bed and shore for Crown ownership purposes is dictated by the Fisheries Act, or, well, it's not dictated by it, but it's delineated. So when somebody would come out and do a survey, they would look to the Fisheries Act to determine where private land is and where the Crown-owned shore and bed is. And basically the language there is that the land covered so long by water as to rest it from vegetation, so there's no vegetation there, or to make a distinct character in vegetation where it extends into the water or the soil itself. So it's basically looking at the vegetation transition and how that is to be surveyed. As I mentioned, there's exemptions under the Water Act and Water Ministerial Regulation. There's a code of practice for placing, constructing, installing, maintaining, replacing, or removing a watercourse crossing without an approval. So you don't need an approval for that activity so long as you abide by the code of practice, which is published and amended from time to time. I also give you some examples. Schedule 1 of the regulation sets out other areas where approvals aren't required for activities. So the code itself sets out certain requirements, including providing notice to the department. It also includes the types of plans that are required and the conditions that must be abided by. They vary by the type of crossing and the type of water body that you're interacting with. So it's really kind of a long code of practice, and sometimes you have to get engineers involved or aquatic specialists involved to determine what type of process or conditions or obligations you have in relation to that code of practice. There's the ability to deal with temporary crossings or low-level crossings. This is typically the type 4 type of crossings where it's a low level. It's basically at the level of the bed. And again, there's various standards and conditions associated with them. You might have to engage an aquatic environment specialist for certain types of classes of water bodies. And really, the timing and issues with temporary crossings may not make it suitable for livestock crossings in some instances. And you'll notice the bullet under the first sub-bullet is around fish and fish habitat. And that's where involvement of DFO and issues around approvals, both provincially and federally, can arise. It's more concern and due diligence is required. In terms of the approval process on the Public Lands Act side, there may be a need for a license of occupation if you're actually occupying the shore or bed somehow in terms of putting in pilings or other types of things. There also may be a need for a temporary field of authorization in certain instances. And those are two types of dispositions or grants of rights to operate in Crown land, basically in the bed and shore. As I mentioned, the municipal role may apply specifically if the land has been subdivided. Typically, this won't be a case for agricultural lands, but if there has been subdivision, there might be environmental reserve, in which case the municipality has taken ownership of the land. There might be bylaws and development conditions as well. Section 60 of the Municipal Government Act says that municipalities has the direction, control, and management of bodies of water within the municipality, including the airspace above and the ground below. So it does create this general power of municipalities, but it is subject to other pieces of legislation like the Water Act or the Public Lands Act. Finally, we move on to the Fisheries Act, which, if there is fish or fish habitat, this will be a central focus in how you go about your work in a water body or near the shoreline. The main prohibition in this area relates to what we often shorten to HADD, or HAD. And that means no person shall carry on any work, undertaking, or activity that results in the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. Now, this has been in place, well, previously this was in place for many years. It was changed in 2012, but then it was changed back to the HAD provision more recently in 2016, I believe, maybe 2017. In any event, the amendments came into effect a bit later than that. And there's also a prohibition around releases to waters frequented by fish, and you cannot release things that are deleterious to fish. And that can include things like sediment, although often sediment is typically also a harmful alteration to habitat. Often under the Fisheries Act, one would seek a review and whether there's a need for an authorization. And there is an interim code of practice currently in play for temporary stream crossings. And again, this deals with timing and a bunch of things like that. But really, the main focus of or the main approach to codes of practice is to understand that it's guidance to avoid harming fish habitat. So it's always important, in the language that's included in the interim code of practice says it doesn't remove or replace the obligation to comply with all statutory and regulatory requirements of the Fisheries Act and other pieces of legislation. And I think that's just a note that you have to be very aware in terms of how you apply the code of practice, that how there's quite a bit of some vagueness in the code of practice where you have to be aware that a harmful alteration or disruption could apply or could occur if you're not careful. So a couple of case examples. These one recently from Alberta, where there's a motocross race and a prosecution related to going through a water body with dirt bikes, and there was a significant fine in that case related to that, because there was west of cutthroat trout in the area. And similarly, there's very few, I should note, but there is an older case in BC where cattle in a creek, where there was trout and coho salmon habitat. There was a significant amount of alteration and disruption of the habitat, and their prosecution ensued. Now, in this case, the landowner had failed to comply with some directions of the officers in that case to remedy the issues. They were suggesting putting in salt licks and a variety of other things to help keep the cattle out of the water body. And it ended up, after the fact, they ended up fencing the area with some help from a government grant. But there was a prosecution in this case and a significant fine that occurred. So it does happen. It's very rare because there's often opportunities to mitigate or avoid impacts at certain times. But it is to be, I mean, it's still clear that if there is fish habitat being impacted, there is that risk. So with that, I will stop my sharing. Hopefully the sound didn't make too many problems there.
Great, thank you, Jason. That was really good to help us understand the complexities, which are quite a few actually. So we've been posting a few links in the chat. If you didn't see them on the things that Jason has been referring to, some of the regulatory links. So if you didn't see them already, do have a look there. And I think we'll maybe if we could take one or two questions for Jason. There aren't any in the Q&A box yet, but feel free to put them there. We'll also, if we can't get them all right now, we'll get to them at the end when we do the overall panel discussion. So Jason, maybe one of the things that I would love if you could expand upon just a little bit or clarify is what do you think, I guess, the uses in Alberta, particularly because the one example you showed was in BC, obviously, of the other sort of regulatory pieces, I guess. Are you familiar with, or have you heard about prosecutions that are using these things, or is it mostly going through code of practice and therefore maybe it's not going to the courts and people are following the right kind of approvals?
Right. So I haven't heard too much in terms of water, like cattle and water type of process issues. There has been numerous kind of disruption of fish habitat through off-highway vehicles and motocross races and that type of thing. So that has been more of an issue. That being said, I know obviously with cows and fish leading the way there, a lot of the challenge is related to how we manage the landscape and watering and all these other things of livestock. We have to be aware that these regulations are the first step of understanding that they are strong prohibitions and that there are risks related to that. So we have to try and take as many measures as we can to mitigate those. But that being said, I'm not aware of any concerted effort by the enforcement agencies in that regard.
Great, thank you. I think in the interest of time, we might actually move on to our next speaker, and that gives everybody lots of time to think about all the questions. Thank you very much, Jason. That was great. We're going to move on to speaker number 2, which is Adam Norris. And due to the challenges of the real world, which is bandwidth, Adam is going to be assisted by Carrie O'Shaughnessy, I believe. We've had, when you have rural bandwidth, there's only so much you can sometimes show with a video and a PowerPoint. So they're going to work together. Hopefully it works out. We tested this before. So while they're getting that up and running, and Adam maybe has his video on right now, which is great. I'll just introduce him. He's Adam Norris is the watershed coordinator at the Mighty Peace Watershed Alliance, as the technical support and project manager for this multi-stakeholder watershed group. He gets the challenge of understanding how human activities affect the watershed, identifying the kinds of levers that we can use to change those impacts, and of course, encouraging implementation of those kinds of approaches. So beyond his role in the non-government world, his children, outdoor pursuits, off-the-grid living, and libraries are regular parts of his calendar. And we also want to note he has a pretty great, cool background, which is really actually his house. So I'll turn it over to Adam. Take it away.
Thanks. Marvin, don't you dare go in that water. You know you're going to get hoof rot. No, Martha, it's okay. I'm not in the water. I'm on the water. Look, I can do jumps. So everyone who has livestock or been around operations understands the challenges of moving livestock between pastures to overwintering areas to areas where they're going to be calving out. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about a project I did. As mentioned, I'm with the Mighty Peace Watershed Alliance. And what I'd first like to note, though, is this project was one done by several great partners: Agroforestry Woodlot Extension Society, Alberta Conservation Association, the County of Grand Prairie Egg Service Board, and Cows and Fish. We had funding from Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program through the Government of Alberta. So we called this project Improved Livestock Crossing. And we came across a particular site, and talking to that producer, there were several challenges that came up, and I'm sure you'll find them familiar. So there was a crossing that had been placed, but it had been washed out. So now this producer was left with long drives around on public roads, which means obviously issues with traffic and also going across bridges, which cows don't like, and the extra time and distance covered, as well as trying to get hands to help you move livestock. When they had tried some crossing directly through the stream, there were some issues. Obviously, you can imagine water quality was being impacted, the riparian area, so that banks, it was being chewed up, the vegetation was being stripped. And of course, there are concerns around livestock health when they get mired down and issues with their feet sometimes. So there are a bunch of issues that we needed to address. And so in this project, understanding those were the challenges, we thought, okay, what do we need to be able to do to solve this? And for us, we wanted something that could work in the climate. So we're up in the Peace watershed. We have long winters. We typically have a high runoff in spring. There's some of those things you have to consider, right? And as well, we want to be realistic, not just something that could be done in sort of a demonstration, but also implemented by practical operations. And we want it to be transferable. We wanted it to be able to be adapted for different situations. So we first started by asking a bridge company, you know, what's your cheapest option for this sort of crossing? And the cheapest we could find was $85,000. So that obviously was no longer realistic. So we had to look at other things. The other aspect we knew we had to consider were regulations. And regulations are actually good things, right? They're intended to prevent us from causing unintended consequences, negatively impacting the environment, our neighbors, ourselves, those sorts of things. And really, the big thing with this project, we wanted to figure out how to avoid getting into trouble with those regulations and figure out how to get best through them. So the first thing that we need to look at is where do those regulations apply and how does that work for us? So Jason has given you this great overview, and I'm going to try to apply it a bit to our situation. So the first one we had to think about was the Public Lands Act. In this one, you have to ask about whether you're going to be affecting the bed and shore, and that Surveys Act thing came up, and that's really where the water can be even up to high mark. Okay, so that's what we'll have to be careful there. We can go beyond that. And we did. We checked with the approval writer, said if we're beyond that point, do we need anything? And I've posted here the actual email that we received from the approval writer. Now, if you're not in the bed and shore, you don't need anything from public lands. Again, I'll mention that's specific to the approval writer we had in the Peace region. You always have to check, but we've heard that multiple times, and I think that's a pretty common theme. When it came to the Water Act, the Water Act applies to the bed and shore, of course. You can't be altering that. But also there's a bigger component. It has that activities that may negatively impact aquatic environment. So you have to be a little more careful about anything that might be going into the water. So it's not always going to be necessary to have an approval to do things on the upland, but you might need that. And that's similar with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, or the Fisheries Act. That's the federal one. Same thing. The real concern is in the water and where there's fish habitat. However, there is an expanded component, that deleterious substance. So if you dump something into fish habitat that affects fish or their habitat, sediment, diesel spill, those sorts of things, you could be in trouble. So you have to be careful. So when we looked at this, we realized it's pretty obvious. We're going to have to focus on a structure or a crossing approach that kept us on the upland. We're not on the bank, we're not on the bed, we're not on the shore. That'll solve a lot of issues for us. So let's take a look at this site. This here is the crossing. So you can see there was fencing along here. This is where they're moving cows. And this here is actually the photo that I sent in the approval writer. I took a photo, I marked lines on it, said this is where the crossing will span, upland to upland. And they said, we don't need anything from you. Again, check with them, but they were fine with that, having put that together. I mentioned there were washed out crossings tried beforehand. We've seen this often, and it's challenging, right? It takes a lot of time. It seems cheaper at first, but you have to keep on going back, pulling those in, trying to create that crossing. And in these accidental washouts, there is really a concern that you might run amok of some of the regulations. So yeah, do be careful with doing these sorts of things. So what we end up doing is going, and where those two blue lines are, we had a contractor drive oil field pipe in, and this was, you know, salvaged oil field pipe. We're in Alberta. It's one of those resources, so it's something very cheap, right? We were able to get that for free. There's some scrap or salvaged again I-beams that we welded to that. After that, we got a rig mat and installed that on top of these I-beams and just welded those together. So it's a pretty solid structure by this point. And you can see there are some pipes sticking up. And what that's all about is that just made the best way to attach the panels. So with panels attached, we end up with a crossing that looks like this. Great, huh? We've got livestock, the dog's crossing, it looks happy, we've got a happy producer, we go from upland to upland, we've checked with the Water Act and public lands people and with fisheries people, we're all good, right? Seems perfect, just need the livestock, and there was the problem. The livestock didn't want to cross this. So even those of you who do drives across public roads and bridges there, you know, I'm not a livestock person, but I've heard from many of them that their cows in particular don't like crossing bridges, even on those public roads. So the cows were balking, and it took some effort for sure. And again, kudos to the producer. Many things were tried, including training, always putting out pails of oats on there and trying to get them out there. That started getting them on there. And then eventually plywood was attached to those railings so that the line of vision for these cows looking down into the creek was blocked. And then straw went on there. So this was to dampen the sound and make it less echoey and bouncy. We're not exactly sure what combination worked, but with all this, we were able to get to the point where cows started to go across. And we'll see if that video will play. Is it going to play? I think it's going. The internet will work for us. Or not. Maybe we'll have to play that separately. Okay. So anyhow, I can run that for you when we're done, or pop out of the presentation and show you that. One thing I would note before we go forward, that straw then too, with that there, you'll have to be careful if you end up going that route, how you're going to clean it, right? Obviously there's straw and there's manure there, so be careful when you're moving that it goes to the other sides and not into the creek. Oh, it looks like it's starting now. Do you see that on your end? No, it sounds like it's running from my end.
No, it's not playing for us, Adam.
We'll skip over. Okay, Soda was running from my end, but maybe not. Okay, so there we go. That was this project, and that was the first one we had done, and we were happy with that. In fact, we, sort of document that process, we put together a fact sheet. If you go to mightypeacewatershedalliance.org, you can find that, or I'm sure, the rest of our partners, Oz, ACA, Cows and Fish, County Grand Prairie, they have that too. And it just sort of details some of the challenges, the regulations we needed, and some of the costs. So I talked about we wanting this to be transferable. And can we do this differently? And knowing what we really needed, that we wanted a sturdy crossing that you could get livestock across, that was affordable. What was the next application? And it turned out one of the other applications we ended up doing didn't have livestock at all, but it had equipment. And so this equipment piece is interesting because there are different things you have to consider. Obviously, railings aren't a good idea. They're not going to fit. It's a lot heavier. And because it's heavier, you're going to have to think about the structure differently. So we had a producer, and this was his crossing. And he was going across here. And the problem was it had real challenges because it was getting worse every year. A lot of years he couldn't get through. At the end, he was having to go around again on a highway, ask permission to go through his neighbor's field, and try to access his field from that side. So a real challenge. And we thought, okay, well, we can do this. And we looked at this and thought the biggest problem is going to be that weight. So we're going to have to look at how do you support that weight across this span. And what happens there is we had to put pilings in. And this is different because pilings are then in that water body. We're not doing this upland to upland. We're there where we know we're definitely going to need an approval from at least the Water Act and public lands, and probably Department of Fisheries and Oceans as well. On the diagram you see up there, that blue line is the Talveg, or the sort of the deepest part of the stream. So you can see we're right in there, and we have to be careful with that. So we had this design, and we had to go to an engineer. There's really not, I mean, you can do it yourself, I guess, if you're, well, if you are an engineer. Somebody with a stamp has to be able to sign off on this. And so we took this design, the engineer looked at this and added these components, you know, the cobble, some of the depths things that they want to see, because the code of practice has some prescriptions. And if you follow them, then it's more of a notification procedure. You don't actually have to go through a big, long review. So the engineer knows what's put in there. They put their seal on it, send it in, we were good. So that's what that ended up looking like there. In this case, we needed that code of practice, which addresses both the Water Act and the temporary field authorization for and the disposition for public lands. And we also had to go to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and that was more that review. We didn't actually have to get an authorization, but we had to go through and check and see through FIMIS, the Fish and Wildlife Management Information Management System, the Alberta repository, where all the records of fish are, and take a look and see, are there fish here? Would we be impacting habitat? And submit that to DFO. They reviewed it and said, okay, we're okay to go. So there's obviously a bit more involved if you're going to be doing anything in the stream. At the end, we end up having a crossing that looked like this. And this was a double wide rig mat, so twice as wide as the original crossing you've seen. And you can see it's using pilings, and he was going across with his sprayer and seeder. And the real big thing to worry about here was that weight in that fully loaded fluid, right? So we're talking about tons of weight going across. And we were able to have this work only because of those pilings. But again, that means you have to be looking at a different set of regulations that you have to apply for. And there's that arrow pointing to the middle pilings that were in the almost in the middle of the stream, as well as the brown arrows are pointing to now those other pilings that are in the bed and shore, as you would call it there. So if you're going to be in a water body, you're going to need a bunch of different approvals. And for us, in this case, it was the code of practice and that review by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Okay, well, that is the presentation that I have for you. And I guess we could pull up that video. I'm sure everyone would like to see cows going across the bridge. It's sort of cute. Carrie, do you still have that on your end, or should I? Well, I don't know if I can share from my end with the internet the way it is right now.
Hello. I can find it. I just don't have it right handy.
We'll dig that up.
Maybe, Adam, while Carrie's digging that up, we could do a question. Sorry, you muted yourself instead of unmuted yourself.
Oh, yeah. Let's do some questions.
So one of the kind of comments and the questions maybe you could comment on, it says they're wondering if rubber livestock mats instead of straw might be an option to absorb sound on the structure. Did you guys think about that, or have you had any experience with that on other sites?
I haven't. I would love to know. more about them. I'm not even sure what exactly those might look like. I could take a guess, but as mentioned, I'm not a livestock person. I come from the water perspective, so I would like to see those, and that's a great suggestion. I'd like to try that out.
Yeah, and then, I mean, there wouldn't be the need to replace it or remove it. You still might need to clean it off, I suppose, but yeah, that's definitely an interesting suggestion.
Well, there you go. Whoever suggested that, you can put your name on that and a patent on it, and now you have, you know, your name's crossing. It's great.
Yeah, absolutely. So the person that submitted that, feel free to send us a note if you know a source for that, because that would be pretty good. It looks like Carrie has the video ready, so we'll just pause the questions for a second and take it away, Carrie.
Yeah, and so you'll notice that, you know, again, there are many tricks involved, right? There's someone trying to pull the lead cow across, and that's the producer here. He's got some guys behind, some hands helping him sort of drive them down these chutes, and of course, you'll notice at the other end there'll be a pail of oats that he's been baiting with. So you have to try, you know, different options, right? So it's always amazing once you get that lead cow to move. It seems like the rest of them are happy to try it out. Thanks, Gary.
So Adam, maybe another question or two. Can you, I guess, tell us, like, how did it come about that you began working on these projects? How did you come to get on and involved in these projects?
Yeah, so as mentioned, right, it's a great group of organizations that work together, Oz, ACA, County of Grande Prairie, and Cows and Fish. And this was a site that was known to the County of Grande Prairie, and they said, you know, this is an issue that this producer has talked about, and could we find a solution for that? And we'd heard that same issue, so we went and got grant funding, and this was the producer where, you know, we started, and he was willing to put in a lot of in-kind, so he did a lot of work and some of that installation and dug up some of the materials, and obviously spent time altering how we managed and moved cows to train them and get them across that crossing. So it was sort of through that relationship with the Ag Service Board, I guess.
Right, which is a good reminder that it's that putting those all together that made it all happen, for sure. So I think we're going to move on to our next speaker. And we'll, again, please keep adding your questions in the Q&A box. And thank you very much, Adam. That was great. It's good to see that interesting set of projects that you guys have been involved in. And we'll hear some more about the details of that, I'm sure, in the Q&A session. So our next speaker is going to be Becky. And Becky, if you want to just sort of bring yourself up so we can see you, that'd be great. And Becky de Valeriola, I keep trying to get it smooth, sorry, Becky, is with us tonight from the ALIS, or Alternative Land Use Services, Northern Sunrise Program. She's the coordinator and is the boots on the ground, working with agricultural producers to create cleaner air, cleaner water, and more biodiversity. ALIS Northern Sunrise is currently the northernmost ALIS program in Canada and is based in Northern Sunrise County, which is near Peace River for those that aren't familiar. Becky is a passionate advocate for building the production of ecosystem services into our working landscapes. So Becky's going to talk about livestock crossings and one of the examples that they have worked on. So take it away, Becky.
Great, thank you, Norrie. Okay, hi everybody. So as Noreen mentioned, I'm here today to share our experience with installing a livestock crossing on private land in the Heart River watershed. We'll be looking at the Squarak Riparian Enhancement Project that we started in May of 2019, and we will be completing it in September of 2021. So let's talk a little bit about the vision and the project scope. So over the years, this third generation producer has seen a decline in his pasture health on the home quarter. And as a former member of our Watershed Advisory Committee and a steward of the land, Terry approached ALIS Northern Sunrise to assist with returning the riparian zone to its natural state. Even when you're an active steward of the land, this size of project can be daunting and it's hard to take on by yourself. So he wished to install a livestock crossing, exclusion fencing with reforestation to follow. This corridor is currently supporting agriculture and livestock production and was being utilized up to and including the waterway. With this project, we are supporting 6 acres of riparian enhancement and 5 acres of upland forest. This is a perfect example of shifting agricultural services to environmental services. Now we're producing cleaner air, cleaner water, and more biodiversity, all of which have an economic value. So there are 3 phases to this project. Number 1, our crossing, and the goal was to install a government-approved livestock crossing to facilitate access to the primary watering source at the corrals. In addition, a portable solar watering system will be available in the field. We then would be moving on to riparian fencing, where we're looking at excluding about 750 meters of waterway with a minimum 25-meter setback from high water mark. This would require some 1,600 meters of fencing. The project complements an existing 920 meters of established riparian enhancements on the north end of the property. After those 2 components are in place, we can go in and start reforesting. There's been a die-off of trees due to a few different factors. So to offset this, we'll be reforesting the mentioned 5 acres of upland. So let's just take a little walk around the property. So here we see this area here. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. But at the south end of the property is where the water comes in, and there's a bridge, which is a 3-meter pipe culvert, considered a bridge. You can see the flow of the water, where our solar watering system will be. There's also an erosion site that we're working on, location of the crossing. The dotted lines to the right of it will be the reforestation area. To the left of them, to the north, is where the existing riparian fence sits. So picture 1, you can see there's the culvert. Sorry, I couldn't get in front of it to get a good picture of it. So you can imagine that the volume of water that flows through this area and high water events is substantial. And on several occasions, the producer has tried to put in culverts, but as you can see, they are continually washed out. So when we put in the crossing, we were able to remove the debris from the waterway. We had the excavator there and he gently picked it all out. And now that we have a lawyer in the room, Jason, do we need a permit to remove these items? You can let me know later. So we all are on a learning curve. Here are some more photos from my visit when I went out in June of 2019. The photos on the left, those are the protected riparian area, so you can see how well it's rejuvenated itself. And to give you an example of the challenges of the forest, you can see the diseased trees and the devastating effect it's had on the area. Now let's move forward with project details. So step 1, we needed to find a suitable location with the least amount of disturbance to the waterway. Yeah, we found it, and here we are at this wonderful location that provided us with the desired top-of-bank to top-of-bank span that was above the high water mark. Then we needed to acquire our public lands approval. So this is where I, like everybody else, gets a little bit nervous, and it was time to bring in the experts. So I reached out to Adam Norris with the Mighty Peace Watershed Alliance to help us out. Adam and I met on site to assess the location, and from there, Adam worked his magic. With that said, Adam reached out to Alberta Environment and Parks Lands team lead regarding the public land authorization. Adam provided GOA with the project description, location, and pictures. To expand upon this, please refer to the example text below. Once he applied for land titles, actually it happened very quickly. They got back to him within a couple hours, and the response was, if the pilings are to be installed above the high water mark on private land with no disturbance to the bed and bank, and the crossing structure is a single span, there is no public lands approval required, nor is a temporary field authorization required. Honestly, this wasn't really what I expected to receive for information, so it was wonderful. Armed with this great information, I moved forward to talk with our development officer in the county, and it was relayed to me that no permits were required at the municipal level as the project was approved by GOA and it was on private land. So this was great news. We were ready to move forward, and actually our timeline, it happened quicker than I thought. So step 3, we need to have a site meeting with the producer, Mighty Peace, and the contractor. An action plan needs to be created. Everybody did their part, and before we knew it, HAE, the contractor, had procured and delivered a 40-foot steel frame drag mat that was supplied by Matco of Grand Prairie. Next, we had Chinchaga pilings and anchors. They came out to install the 25-foot screw pilings and to put a cap on top of the pilings. From there, we were able to start installation. HAE came on site. They pushed the deck into place with the bucket. They then reloaded the equipment, moved it over onto the east side of the property, and finished pulling the structure into place and stabilized. The slope was a little greater than what we liked, so they worked on decreasing the slope for livestock passage. There was only so much that we could do, so one way of combating this challenge was to install the fence with a very wide apron versus a narrow chute. So now we have the structure in place, it's awaiting sides, and it needs to be welded down to the pilings and cap. Welder came out, added the side panels, and voila, our crossing is complete. And here she is in all her glory, and we are super pleased with how it turned out, and we're so excited to watch the area regenerate. Now we get on to budget. So we budgeted about $25,000 for the structure. Our cost came in at roughly $20,000 to procure and install the crossing. Thank you to everyone for bringing us in under budget. And our funding support on this came from Alberta Conservation Association. I did a grant application, it was approved. Also did up a grant application to the Government of Alberta, to the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Fund. It was approved. We have Alice Canada that helps us with all our projects, and Northern Sunrise County that has a riparian improvement fund, and also my time. And of course, at the center of it, we have our producer, who not only commits funds towards it, but many hours of in-kind. So to finish off, we have phase 2 happening. So we did get that in the ground. We've got 1,540 meters of four-strand wildlife fencing. And as I mentioned, in the fall of 2021, we have a planned planting of about 5,000 one-year-old native species seedlings that will be planted in those protected areas. To help assist with seedling health, we will be using hemp weed suppression mats. We've used them on other projects and they work very well. So, and I touched upon that there was an erosion site, so I just kind of wanted to share this with you. We were out there in the fall of 2019 trying to look after the erosion site. The picture of the cows with the measuring wheel. I had a lot of fun out there that day measuring the site, and it was funny, as I would bring the wheel up the side to measure the side of the bank, the cows would all step back, and then as I'd move away, they'd come back in. So I kind of wonder what their discussion was when I left there. So as you can see, it was a joint effort with Northern Sunrise County. We had Alberta Conservation out the, Alberta Conservation Association and the producer. So these are our project partners, and as you can see, it can take a community to implement a project like this, or should I say it's far easier if the community is involved. I highly recommend you contact your local municipality, your not-for-profit organizations, as we're often able to access resources that are not readily available to individuals, which in turn we can pass along to you. And Adam touched upon that too. So now that you see how easy it is, it's time to install your crossing. Thank you for this opportunity to share our experience, and honestly, together we can make huge differences.
Thank you so much, Becky. That was really great, and I'm glad to see all the kind of the whole context of the other parts of the project, because it's not just one piece, it's kind of weaving together. So that was really good to understand. There was a comment actually a bit related to that, a question for you. Wondering if you were able to use any of the downed trees in your sort of repurposing of them, I guess, in your project for erosion control, or did you have to remove them? And I'm not sure if they are necessarily meaning the downed trees, maybe
Okay.
where you showed the forest has been declining.
Okay. In this project, no, we have not put in a log gabion. It is something that is needed because a lot of those rocks that you saw, such high runoff coming off the field, a lot of them washed away.
Wow.
So we do need to go back there in next year, and we will be looking at putting in a log gabion. At that time, yes, we will source those supplies from the land. We have worked on a log gabion prior with cows and fish, and with that, we did use logs that were found in the ditches from our mowing program. I'm with Agricultural Services, and what our team goes out and cleans the ditches. So those were repurposed. Also, any of the rocks that we use are repurposed also from our mowing program.
Oh, good to know. Can you maybe, for those that don't know what a log gabion is, can you kind of visually describe it for people?
Oh, Carrie could probably do it better. So it's a step down structure. So it kind of acts as a waterfall. So we put in our base. So we have one layer of logs, and then we start building upon that. We create that step feature. So then your side is going to be like this. We create a waterfall. And when we did our others, we created the waterfall. We also placed some live silt fences that were weaved with willows, poplars and willows. And on that particular site, at that time we put them in, they were probably about 2 feet high were our silt fences, and they're already covered. So they have retained that much soil. So yeah, we need to go back in and we need to build those up. So yeah, it's a wonderful project that's happening out there. It's been in the ground 3 years, and that quickly we're seeing it come back.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, the goal is it traps sediment, so then it gets buried, and then you got to build on top of it so it gathers more. And so for those people that haven't seen one, those logs are basically touching each other like matchsticks, and pointing down or upslope, depending how you look at it, but laying flat, and you're creating a little set of stairs with logs essentially that are adjacent to each other. So maybe the other thing that people won't know necessarily, I know some of the folks on the webinar will, but can you tell people a bit about how ALICE, this is relevant for ecological goods and services in the ALICE program?
Yes. So with the ALICE program, they're just all about sustaining or conserving or improving. So the way it's a perfect fit for our program. We're working with livestock. We have a producer. He's making money off the land. And with this, so ALICE, geez, sorry, organize my thoughts. ALICE Canada, they help us not only with the establishment costs, but they also, for the areas that we're taking out of production, that marginal land, we are compensating, I don't know if compensating is the right word, we're rewarding the producer with an annual maintenance fee. So in the way that those fees are developed are through your, at a community level, through your partnership advisory committee. In our area, we went off local land rates, rental rates is what we used. So it's not much, but it definitely helps. And he wasn't making much off it before, so now we've improved it. And ALICE Canada will also claim our carbon sequestration credits.
Gotcha. So there's multiple aspects in there for sure.
Yeah.
And so just to give you a heads up, those of you that are listening and watching, Carrie has also provided a comment about the log. It's another term for it is a log step down, which is quite a good description. It's a set of logs that you keep stepping down, like the series, just like you described it, Becky. Yeah. Another reminder in the chat is just to do call before you dig. Because if you are digging big holes, you might run into things you don't know are there. You never know. There's old pipelines and utilities sometimes.
Oh, and there was. So the contractor looked after that. But yeah, in this case, the utility lines actually ran diagonal across property. So yes, always call before you dig.
Yeah, or whatever the web version of that is. The online tech. Look it up before you dig at least.
Yeah.
Do a one call for sure. There is a comment, and this goes to both really because it's relevant to your project, which is similar to the one that Adam talked about, that the mats that this person suggested are made of recycled rubber, something like 48 by 60 inches, so 4 by 5 feet-ish, and about 3/4 inch thick, that they know that 4-H people use. So not sure about where there's a post which we'll share in the chat box about where you might get them.
Okay, great. I made a note, so that's good.
Yeah, this is an opportunity to learn from each other and share ideas. So let's see, what else is in our Q&A section?
And I can add to it. Clearly, we mimicked Adam's bridge. Yes, I used his information sheet. Yes, I gave it to the contractor. And yeah, it made the process much easier.
Yeah,
so thank
absolutely.
you, Maggie Peace, and everybody else.
Yeah, might as well build on what others have already done successfully, including
100%.
including have them as part of your project.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm just posting the mat information, and I don't want to steal kudos, but we don't want to acknowledge people's names on here because they aren't visible to other participants. So for the person that posted the mat piece, I'm posting it in the chat on your behalf, and if you want to share your name, you're welcome to do so. Thank you for sharing. The Alberta Recycling might be the place for it. That could be, or some other mats provider. So I think what I'd like to do is ask all three of our panelists to join us. That was really great, Becky. Thank you.
Thank you.
These projects being successful is really, it turned out that there wasn't a lot of complicated approvals, but you went through the steps to find that out, which was really positive. So if all three of us can join together, you guys will start to take some questions as a group. So if you have questions, again, for our audience, please make sure you post them in there. So I'll maybe frame this one for Becky and for Adam, more about the installation and challenges. I guess, have you had them in long enough? They're pretty new. Have you had them in long enough to get any feedback from kind of other people in the community or landowners saying, hey, maybe I could do that, or could you help me do that? Have you had any feedback?
Okay, I'll go ahead. No, it's pretty fresh. No, that hasn't happened. So hopefully once we get the word out there and show examples, then we'll see more of this.
Yeah, we were lucky enough. That first one went in 2017, 17, I believe. And yeah, we hosted a tour in 2018. October 2018, and since then we've had a couple more installed. So people saw them, they liked them, and it is really interesting to me. Again, like I said, I'm not an egg person, or don't have livestock, but it seems like every producer has a different approach to how to get those animals, whatever they be, including bison or goats, have come up, get across. Oh, donkeys! I forgot donkeys, but get them across these bridges, right? And that's, again, right, like, there's an idea that I was lucky enough to be part of this team that we were able to implement, but it's really up to the producers out there. They're the ones who are going to make it work. They know how their animals function, and I mean they're the piece that makes it all work.
Yeah, and certainly every situation, and certainly different kinds of livestock might have different needs as well. Again, probably for Adam and Becky, or which both of you, if you'd like to comment, can you tell us a little bit more about the long-term plan for these sites? And certainly the pictures and your description were that they are being fenced out and they have these wingspans to direct the cows to the right spot. But what's the grazing plan or the grazing associated plan that was happening before, and where's it going in the future?
I can speak to that. We have installed in that riparian area where we fence, there are 2 cattle gates, one on each side. And once that area has rejuvenated and repaired itself, the producer will be allowing his cattle in there to maybe do a mock graze and then pull them back out. So the area will be used again once it's healed. Gotcha.
Okay, Adam, do you want to add anything about your project?
Yeah, and again, it just speaks to the situation. We've seen a lot of different setups. That first one that we showed There was a degraded riparian zone, and part of that was to rejuvenate it, put in electric fencing, and that was being rejuvenated. Once it was back into good health, the plan was to do some intermittent, or I'm not sure what the phrasing, but that pulse grazing where they go in and then they're pulled out, trying to avoid that wet time. Some of them, it was, the one installation was between two paddocks really. And so we did some live staking on either side of the crossing, and that was never going to be touched again because it was actually a draw where water was flowing. And this was really about moving these animals between the two paddocks. One of the other applications, and it all depends. There was more bush involved, right? So it was going to more to a that sort of setting. So it wasn't, the chute led them in there, but it was from a trail. So there wasn't as much that use or prolonged use in that riparian zone. So.
Great, thank you. It's good to just for people to have that context of like what's the management now and in the future. So maybe a question for Jason.
I do have one.
Oh, sure, go ahead, Becky. Sorry, go ahead.
And I was serious about us pulling those culverts out. Like, we didn't have any equipment in the waterway. Like, he was up on, upland and just reached over and gently pulled those culverts out. But after the fact, now I'm kind of wondering, should have we had something in place or what?
For removing, well, I mean, whenever you're disturbing the bed, I think it's always a good question to put your mind to, whether you're decommissioning something or maintaining something or building something, right? It kind of covers the whole, from conception to kind of the final withdrawal of the culvert, for instance. But yeah, that's a good question, and I think there's certain codes of practice provincially to deal with outfalls and culverts and stuff like that as well. But yeah, it's good to think about it anyway. And because if it does create, I mean, there's a chance of sedimentation, and I'm not sure how DFO, it would probably say about the timing and that type of thing. As long as that was okay, then it should be okay for fisheries, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's really important. No, there is an interim federal code of practice for culvert maintenance. That was not really maintenance because they've already washed out, obviously. So I think it would be definitely one of those situations where you'd want to get the guidance, obviously. And for those people that are doing culvert maintenance, there are guidelines and criteria as well federally. So I think it was one of the, I think we've shared that in the chat already as well. Okay. Where was I going to go with my question now? No, that was good. That was good. I mean, this is one of those things. It's like, what's the harm? Should we leave the culvert in? Probably not, because you should also be cleaning up messes that happen accidentally. Even in that case, like you said, the culverts keep getting washed out, but you still do need to think about the regulations in those situations, for sure. So maybe Jason, for you, from a more of a regulatory perspective, have you seen or heard much in terms of these kinds of challenges related to fish windows, like time of year, and what would be, from a regulatory perspective, like how do people know about those things, or how do you adjust your project from a regulatory perspective about, and fish windows being times you're supposed to avoid being in the water. Can you speak to more of the regulations on that?
Well, I mean, sorry, more feedback there for a second. So the regulations under, for instance, there has to be, for the Fisheries Act, there's got to be more clear kind of codes of practice or classes of authorizations published to kind of clarify the timing issue, because a lot of the reference in the interim codes are more like, well, avoid times when there's fish. So there's required knowledge of the species and the nature of habitat, and a variety of very quite scientific requirements to understand how you can avoid a that harmful alteration. So there isn't a lot of clarity around that, and it's always the important thing is to be precautionary when you approach the water, insofar as getting guidance from fisheries biologists or that type of thing to understand the risks involved. But I think that's where ideally a regulatory system will go where restoration activities can be more clearly understood and delineated, because I think that's a challenge. Understanding what's deleterious to fish, or understanding what's fish habitat, or where fish are frequenting, are challenges I'm sure the department faces, and I know from a prosecution side of things, it's a challenge. So it's a challenge for everybody, and certainly for those landowners and stuff like that. I mean, it's a huge knowledge area where, I mean, I don't think I would certainly need to engage a specialist to understand those risks. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm muted because I think I'm the one causing feedback probably for you. For people listening, and hopefully you notice in the chat for our audience that there are a couple more links posted there that have species specific and location information, a bit more mapping for fish. So if you're interested, make sure you note those links. But it is definitely, you're responsible for knowing, but finding out how to know is definitely not an easy piece. So unlike, you know, a speed limit sign, as long as there's a sign up, then you know what you're supposed to be traveling. But it's a little bit more tricky when we're talking about things that are in water and hard to see. So I wanted to actually maybe just Carrie, who's been helping us with the technology and with Adam's presentation due to bandwidth challenges, has a couple pictures of the structures that Becky was referring to. So I thought maybe this might be an opportunity, because we don't have a ton of questions still in the Q&A. We have just one more to go. So maybe we can just quickly show that. And while Carrie is pulling that up, one of the questions was just to understand, were the webinars yesterday and today the same? And yes, they were, except for, of course, the questions would be unique. The content was pretty much the same. There were a few minor additions based on what we learned yesterday and from Q and the questions, but they're basically the same. So we'll be posting one of these sessions. Carrie, are you able to share that picture?
There we go.
Do you want to go full screen?
Thought I did.
There you go.
So, yeah, so this is the situation. This
So really,
is, I don't know, can you see it?
yeah, we can. Yep.
Yeah. So this is the steps. It's not quite finished yet. There should be a row. This row should be completely completed. This the crew here finished it without me the next day. But you can see that the top logs are the shortest, and then these ones are longer yet, and then the longest on the bottom. And there's gravel and landscape fabric worked in behind. There's the silt fences that she was talking about. There's the log step down at the back, water flowing this direction. And that's what it looks like from the top, looking downstream.
So while you're showing that, I'll ask both Becky and Adam, because I believe you're both involved in this, and Carrie, what were the regulatory pieces that were related to this? Or were there any? Because it's in seasonal water, but is it in a water body that required any considerations, or was it actually more of an upland situation in a field that had a bunch of erosion and therefore didn't require regulatory, you didn't have to work through some of those things? What happened at that site?
So it was uplands, and it's in a field, and it's a drainage ditch, like it's not a drainage ditch, a channel that was flowing through. So this is another Alice project that we did up there. And as a soil conservation officer, it was either we walk in there and we tell the landowner to look after the erosion, or we partner with them and we work on it together. So that's what's happened with this. As a rule, it doesn't have a lot of water in it. When these pictures were taken, there was a lot of water. It was a very wet year. The Heart River was very high, and we actually had some flow back. Now, when that flow back happened, Carrie was out there. I think we were doing a riparian workshop, and there was some little fish in there. So that was a first. I really haven't seen that happen again, Carrie.
Yeah.
So just to be
Yeah,
clear,
so
this wasn't the actual Heart River.
no,
Oh, no.
the Heart River is off in the distance down this photo. But yeah, up until then, up until that year we were there, it basically looked like this.
Yeah.
And it only ran in the spring. So it was basically a run through a field that was cutting through the uplands.
But yeah, significantly cutting through. So
Yeah.
So interesting, and maybe I don't know if you guys have tried these, or if you want to comment on these kind of structures, if they're done in a water body, certainly do need approvals and considerations as well. And for those that didn't see our other session on riparian restoration and bank stabilization, Adam, do you want to add any comment? It's not really stream crossing, although I suppose you might use it to stabilize a surface.
True, yeah. We have done those in the upland situation. We asked about the upland. It's interesting. It's what we would call an ephemeral draw. As mentioned, seasonally, there's water, and generally high runoff years, you see erosion, and that's why you want to do something. So our regulator in the area, when we talked to them, they said, go ahead, you're using one, native materials, and two, you're trying to better something. They didn't want to issue an approval. So we put it in an actual established watercourse, as you're mentioning, like a stream, what people would normally consider that, where you can see a channel. Yes, you most definitely need a Water Act approval and a public lands. And most likely you're going to need something from DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, a Fisheries Act review. Probably they have a sort of a checklist, and I saw that it was posted again in the chat. You can go through that checklist, and it could be you have to go through a review, but yeah, follow that checklist and that'll sort of guide you.
Right, good reminder. And for those that didn't see it, Adam actually talked about that in detail, one of the projects in a prior week when we were talking about riparian restoration and bank stabilization. So the webinar's recorded, so if you want to go watch that and didn't see it, you can learn more about it during that recording. I'm just looking at our questions, and it looks like most of them have all been covered. And we're just about out of time. Are there any additional questions that arose between the three of you, or comments that you guys wanted to cover off and share with people?
No, I do have a picture I could share of before and after with the step down.
Sure.
Okay. I think you're seeing it.
We are.
Yeah. So that's just how you can see how well the land heals itself. That's over seasons.
Yeah, in not very many years, it accumulated a lot of sediment, which otherwise would have kept going, obviously, and eroding even worse.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Neat.
It excites me.
Yeah, these techniques, these erosion control techniques are quite new to Alberta, and those were pretty much the first ones up in the Peace region, except for one we've done in the far south as well. And so lots of opportunity there, especially to start moving them from the upland non-riparian habitats into more waterways. So Jason, anything you wanted to add in terms of any extra tidbits that came up to mind that we didn't talk about?
Well, no, I guess the one thing I would note, I mean, it kind of comes into play with all restoration work, and we've talked about it as in the past too, is there's probably a need for kind of regulatory reform around some of these things to better facilitate the activities that are focused on making things better. We often streamline things that make things worse, but yet we don't streamline things that make them better. No pun intended with the streamlining.
Yeah, absolutely. We along with a few others have had some conversations about that maybe we need to create some code of practice or guidelines or standards for restoration activities that don't, because right now there are for all kinds of other activities, crossings, all kinds of sort of destructive activities in industries and things like that, as long as you follow a standard. So definitely an opportunity there to create some positive standards that would streamline things, maybe make high quality projects happen on the ground. So I want to just thank our presenters again. I'm going to just move back to sharing a screen for a minute to just make sure we acknowledge our funders. And we have one more poll we'd really like people to participate in. So if you could answer this poll, you'll see that there's a couple questions there. And tell us, did you learn something new today? And is it potentially going to influence the activities or the work you do in these areas? So if you can fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. So we'll just give it another minute, and hopefully all of you will get a chance to click on your answers. And again, once you've clicked, just remember to hit submit. So thank you very much for doing that. We'll just, should be able to see the results. It looks like everybody that filled in the poll said they did learn something, which is great. We certainly hope you did today. And quite a few people think that it's going to influence the kind of work that they do in this area too, which is really positive. So thank you for sharing those results. That helps us report back to our funders and also know that the time spent preparing is valuable, and we hope to continue more of these series. So I want to just thank our funders. That was our last poll for the day. And why are we holding this session? And that's because we recognize that landowners and land users' decisions and actions really determine the health of the landscape. And that includes provision of ecological services. And so knowing the regulatory aspects is critical to making that happen. So we want to thank the funding we have from a variety of sources, including our Alberta Agriculture and Forestry Grant, which is a CAP grant through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, as well as funding from our other funders, provincially and federally, from a cows and fish perspective. Our many members that make up our organization and our board. And we again encourage you to join us again next week, hopefully. And there's the contact information for cows and fish, as well as Jason with the Environmental Law Center there. We will be posting a recording from this week, today's probably, or yesterday's, in a few days. And we'll put that out on our social media so you know when and where it is. So you can review it again and get a sense of what steps you might need to follow. So thank you again for joining us. And we hope to see you again soon next week to cover the next topic. So that's going to be recreation and the things you need to consider there, on particularly more on public land. So join us then, and thank you again for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of our speakers and our support staff. Angie and Carrie, couldn't do it without you, that's for sure.
It's great. Thank you.